In the heart of North Africa lies a land of extremes, a vast desert that stretches to the horizon, broken only by ancient ruins and scattered oases. For centuries, Libya had been a forgotten corner of the world, ruled by empires, crossed by caravans, and scarred by colonial conquest. When World War II ended, this barren land found itself free but fragile. In 1951, Libya became an independent kingdom under King Idris I, the first and last monarch in its history. To the outside world, it seemed like a miracle, a new nation rising from the sand. But inside, the cracks were already forming. King Idris was a religious and cautious man, more at home in prayer than in politics. He had led resistance against the Italians decades earlier, but now his rule leaned heavily on British and American support. Two foreign powers, once wartime allies, built military bases on Libyan soil. Wheelus Air Base for the U.S. and Tobruk for the British. In return, Libya received aid, protection, and quiet promises of stability. But for the Libyan people, especially the young, this stability felt hollow. They saw their land divided, a monarchy draped in Western suits and Saudi traditions, while ordinary citizens lived in poverty. Beneath the royal palaces and foreign airfields, resentment began to grow. A generation was coming of age that would no longer accept the rule of kings or the presence of outsiders. In 1969, everything changed. Oil was discovered beneath the Libyan desert. The black gold that had reshaped the Middle East now flowed from Libya's sands. Almost overnight, the poorest country in North Africa became one of its richest. But as billions poured in, inequality deepened. The wealth collected in royal accounts, in foreign corporations, in the hands of a few, while farmers, Bedouins, and laborers saw little of it. For the West, Libya became a new source of fuel. For Libyans, it became a symbol of betrayal. In the classrooms of Benghazi and Tripoli, young men whispered about revolution. They studied the rise of Nasser in Egypt, the colonel who had overthrown his king and defied empires. They read about Arab unity, socialism, and freedom from foreign influence. Among them was a boy named Muammar Gaddafi. Born in 1942 in a Bedouin tent near Sirte, Gaddafi grew up poor, the son of desert herders who owned no land, no wealth, no privilege. But what he did have was conviction. As a teenager, he hung a portrait of Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser in his school dormitory, calling him the savior of the Arabs. He devoured books on revolution and dreamed not of riches, but of change. By the early 1960s, Gaddafi had joined the Libyan Military Academy in Benghazi. There, he found others who thought like him, young officers disillusioned by corruption, nationalism burning in their veins. They called themselves the Free Officers Movement, inspired directly by Nasser's coup in Egypt. To them, Libya's monarchy was not just outdated, it was a foreign puppet, selling their nation's soul for dollars and oil. The plan began in secret. They met under the cover of darkness, in barracks, safe houses, and classrooms. They watched, they waited, and they learned. Every injustice, every symbol of foreign control became fuel for their fire. And in 1969, the fire would finally ignite. It was the night of September 1st, 1969. The desert air was still, heavy with silence. In Tripoli, King Idris was abroad, seeking medical treatment in Turkey, leaving the kingdom in the hands of a fragile regency. That night, a convoy of young officers moved quietly through the darkness. No grand army, no foreign backing, just conviction, secrecy, and unity. At their head, a 27-year-old captain, Muammar Gaddafi. Before dawn, the royal palace was surrounded. Radio stations were seized. Government buildings were taken without bloodshed. The entire coup, astonishingly, lasted only a few hours. By sunrise, Libya had changed forever. The monarchy was gone. The Kingdom of Libya had become the Libyan Arab Republic. On the airwaves, a trembling but determined voice spoke to the nation. "Fellow citizens, your armed forces have undertaken to free you from the corrupt regime that has dragged our beloved country to ruin." The voice was Gaddafi's. Across the world, few noticed at first. It was a small, peaceful coup in a distant land. But in the Arab world, it sent shockwaves. A young man, barely out of his 20s, had overthrown a king without firing a shot and declared a new era of Arab nationalism. In Cairo, Nasser smiled. In Washington and London, concern grew. Libya's oil and military bases were too valuable to lose. But Gaddafi moved fast. Within days, he ordered all foreign flags lowered. He expelled British and American forces and nationalized their bases. The oil industry, once dominated by Western corporations, came under Libyan control. He declared that Libya would be guided not by capitalism or communism, but by Islam, Arab unity, and socialism, a unique blend that would soon become his personal doctrine. To the poor, he was a hero. To the powerful, he was a problem. He replaced the royal constitution with a new revolutionary government, the Revolutionary Command Council, led entirely by military officers under 30. They wore simple uniforms, refused luxury, and vowed to build a nation free from foreign control. But even as the new republic celebrated, questions lingered. Could idealism survive power? Could a revolution born in secrecy bring democracy and justice? And what happens when the liberator becomes the ruler? In the sands of Libya, the answer would take decades to unfold. As the green flag of the revolution rose over Tripoli, the young colonel stood before his people, not as a king, not as a president, but as a brother leader. He promised equality, dignity, and freedom. And for a moment, the dream felt real. But history would show. Revolutions, like the desert wind, can shift without warning, and soon the same fire that freed Libya would begin to burn it from within. In the early hours of September 1st, 1969, Libya awoke to a new sound, not the royal anthem, but the trembling broadcast of a 27-year-old revolutionary. His name was Muammar Gaddafi, and his message was simple. We have reclaimed Libya for Libyans. Across the desert, radios crackled in surprise. The king was gone. The Americans were silent, and the people, long ignored, long voiceless, began to cheer. But behind the euphoria stood a man not yet understood. To the world, Gaddafi seemed an enigma, a soldier who quoted the Quran as easily as he quoted Nasser, who wore no medals and called himself a humble son of the desert. He spoke of justice, dignity, and the rebirth of the Arab nation. And in his youth, there was something magnetic, an energy that made peasants believe, students dream, and the West worry. Under his leadership, the Revolutionary Command Council, RCC, became Libya's new authority. 12 officers, all in their 20s and 30s, ruled without a king, parliament, or constitution. They promised to end corruption, redistribute wealth, and build a state guided by Islam and socialism. But Gaddafi was more than a soldier. He was a visionary and a believer in destiny. Within days of taking power, he renamed the country. The Kingdom of Libya became the Libyan Arab Republic. The flag changed from red, black, and green with a crescent moon to a simple red, white, black tricolor, echoing Egypt's revolutionary colors. Then came the purge of symbols. Palaces were turned into schools, royal portraits burned, and the names of foreign streets replaced with Arabic ones. Gaddafi's message was clear. Libya would no longer kneel before kings, colonizers, or corporations. He expelled British and American troops from their bases, Wheelus and Tobruk, once symbols of Western dominance. To the shock of Washington and London, he did it peacefully, with confidence and timing they couldn't challenge. and when the last American plane lifted off from Libyan soil, crowds cheered as if the country had won a war. Then came the oil. Gaddafi moved to reclaim Libya's most powerful weapon, its petroleum. At the time, Western oil companies, led by giants like BP and Exxon, controlled production and dictated prices. But Gaddafi had studied their contracts, their loopholes, their arrogance. In 1970, he summoned oil executives to Tripoli. Sitting across a long wooden table, he told them that Libya would no longer accept being paid as a beggar for its own wealth. If they refused to raise the price per barrel, he warned, he would shut down production entirely. They thought he was bluffing. He wasn't. Libya became the first OPEC member to demand higher prices and win. Gaddafi's gamble worked. Other oil nations followed, reshaping the global economy. For the Arab world, the young colonel became a hero, the man who had forced the West to listen. For the West, he was a problem, unpredictable, defiant, and driven by ideology more than diplomacy. But inside Libya, change had just begun. Gaddafi launched sweeping reforms. Land was redistributed to poor farmers. Banks and foreign-owned properties were nationalized. Education and healthcare became free. The literacy rate began to climb. Roads were built where there had been sand. For the first time, oil wealth began to touch ordinary lives. Yet the revolution was not only about economics. It was spiritual, cultural, even moral. Gaddafi told his people they were not just citizens, but soldiers in a moral battle against greed, imperialism, and ignorance. He spoke of Islam as a guiding light, but not as a tool of clerics. To him, Islam was a political force, one that should shape governance, equality, and justice. He quoted the Quran in speeches, calling it the Constitution of the Revolution. But behind his fiery sermons and humble image, something else was forming, a system that revolved around one man's vision. The revolution had no parliament, no elections, no opposition. Power rested in the hands of the Revolutionary Council, and in truth, in the mind of its leader. Still, in 1970, most Libyans didn't question him. After decades of monarchy and foreign control, Gaddafi seemed like the future, bold, pure, and incorruptible. He wore no crown. He refused to be called president. He asked to be called simply brother leader. But history shows, revolutions often begin with unity and end with control. And as Gaddafi's influence grew, so too did his belief that he alone understood what Libya and the Arab world needed. By 1971, Gaddafi's ambitions had grown far beyond Libya's borders. He no longer spoke only of national reform. He spoke of Arab unity, of a single nation stretching from the Atlantic to the Gulf. To him, the Arab world had been divided by colonial borders and weakened by self-interest. In speech after speech, he declared, "The Arab nation is one body. When one limb is in pain, the whole body suffers." He believed the time had come for a new generation of leaders to finish what Egypt's Nasser had started, the unification of the Arab people. When Nasser died suddenly in 1970, Gaddafi wept openly. To him, it was like losing a father and inheriting a mission. He reached out to Egypt's new president, Anwar Sadat, proposing a merger of Libya and Egypt into a single state. He did the same with Syria and Sudan, even Tunisia. One by one, he called for unity, and one by one, the offers fell apart. For other Arab leaders, Gaddafi's passion seemed reckless, even naive. They admired his zeal, but not his methods. He wanted overnight revolutions. They wanted gradual diplomacy. Still, Gaddafi pressed on. He poured Libyan money into Arab and African liberation movements, from the Palestinians fighting Israel to anti-colonial rebels in Chad and Niger. He saw himself as part warrior, part philosopher, reshaping not just Libya but the destiny of nations. At home, his control deepened. Political parties were banned. Opposition was branded as treason. State-run media broadcast his speeches daily. School children memorized his slogans: freedom, unity, socialism. He declared that the Libyan people would rule themselves directly through local committees and revolutionary councils. In theory, it was democracy without opposition. In practice, it was power without opposition. In 1973, Gaddafi unveiled what he called the Cultural Revolution. He urged Libyans to seize control of factories, universities, and offices from bureaucrats. He burned Western books he deemed corrupt. He replaced school curricula with revolutionary thought. The revolution now had its own mythology and its own scripture. Within a few years, Gaddafi would publish the Green Book, his personal manifesto that blended socialism, Islam, and tribalism into a single ideology. But even before the book, his message was clear. Libya was not to imitate the West or the East. It would carve its own path. The colonel spoke endlessly about purity and purpose, but those who opposed him began to disappear. New prisons were built. Critics were silenced. Still, the streets of Tripoli buzzed with pride. The oil money was flowing. The poor were eating, and the world was listening. To many Libyans, this was the golden age, when the young desert officer had made their small nation a power that could stand toe-to-toe with empires. To others, it was the beginning of something darker, a cult of personality hiding behind the language of liberation. In those early years, however, the contradictions were still hidden beneath triumph. Gaddafi stood on podiums across Africa and the Middle East, dressed in plain uniforms, his voice echoing like a preacher's. Let us build a new civilization, free from the chains of the past. Crowds roared. The colonel smiled. The revolution was no longer just about Libya. It was about history. And in his mind, the story had only begun. The desert wind carried a strange new power in the early 1970s, the power of oil. And no one wielded it with more defiance than Muammar Gaddafi. In 1973, as the Arab-Israeli war erupted, the world watched in disbelief when Arab oil producers, led by OPEC, turned off the taps. Prices soared, economies trembled, and behind that movement, loudest among them, stood the young colonel from Libya. He declared that oil was not merely a commodity, it was a political weapon. They take our wealth and sell us back their chains, he thundered. Now we will sell them our oil at the price of our dignity. For Western powers, Libya became the face of a new kind of revolution, not one of guns and tanks, but barrels and embargoes. Gaddafi demanded higher prices and stricter control of production. By 1974, he had nationalized most of Libya's oil industry, seizing majority ownership of foreign companies. Tripoli was no longer a backwater desert capital. It had become a fortress of wealth and ideology. Billions flowed into the Libyan treasury. New housing, roads, schools, and hospitals sprang up across the desert. Gaddafi's government promised a people's welfare state, funded by the oil of the poor and not the greed of the rich. To his supporters, he was a visionary,
transforming Libya from colonial poverty into a modern nation. To his critics, he was becoming a dictator cloaked in revolutionary language. But Gaddafi didn't care for critics. He saw himself as chosen by destiny, guided by divine mission and Arab pride. And now, with oil as his sword, he wanted to reshape not just Libya, but the entire world order. He spoke of dismantling capitalism, freeing Africa from imperialism, and uniting the Arab world under one banner of justice. He funded liberation movements from the PLO to anti-colonial fighters in Chad, Eritrea, and South Africa. Everywhere his money and message spread. Revolution is not a choice, it's a duty. But such defiance had a cost. By 1975, Western nations had grown wary. Intelligence agencies painted him as a threat, a volatile, unpredictable leader sitting atop a sea of oil. The CIA described him as a man who believes he is the new prophet of Arab nationalism. Washington began calling him the mad dog of the Middle East. In return, Gaddafi mocked America and Britain in his speeches, accusing them of hypocrisy. He called their democracy a mask for greed and their aid a tool of control. But even as he denounced the West, he studied it closely. He admired its technology, its organization, but despised its values. He believed Libya could surpass both the West's materialism and the East's communism by forging a third path, the third universal theory. It was an audacious idea, a mix of socialism, Islam, and tribal governance, later codified in his Green Book. In it, he claimed to have solved the contradictions of modern politics. Parliaments were corrupt, parties were oppressive, representative democracy was a lie. Instead, Gaddafi proposed direct democracy through people's committees, where every citizen could rule. The theory sounded pure, almost utopian. In practice, it meant absolute control disguised as participation. By 1975, dissent had become dangerous. The early Revolutionary Council members who questioned Gaddafi's authority began disappearing. Some were exiled, others executed. The colonel had learned what all autocrats eventually do: revolutions devour their own troops. Still, Gaddafi's charisma was undeniable. He spoke to his people not like a politician, but like a prophet. Standing beneath the desert sun, he told crowds, "We will not bow to the West. We will lead the world in justice." To the poor and proud, he was a hero. To the powerful, he was a problem that wouldn't go away. And in the mid-1970s, as oil money turned Libya into a fortress of ambition, that problem was about to spill far beyond its borders. By 1976, Libya's influence had grown, but so had Gaddafi's isolation. His dream of Arab unity was fading. Egypt's Anwar Sadat had chosen diplomacy over confrontation with Israel, signing peace accords that Gaddafi saw as betrayal. Gaddafi's fury was public and personal. He denounced Sadat as a traitor to the Arab cause. He cut ties with Egypt, calling its peace with Israel a dagger in the heart of the Arab nation. Once again, Libya stood alone. But Gaddafi didn't retreat. He expanded. He turned his attention south, toward Africa, where colonialism had left scars he vowed to heal. He began funding revolutionary groups from Uganda to Liberia, offering weapons, training, and cash to those fighting Western-backed regimes. Tripoli became a crossroads of rebels, a place where dreams of liberation met the reality of power. From the Irish Republican Army to Black Panther emissaries, all found open doors in Gaddafi's Libya. To some, he was a benefactor. To others, a dangerous meddler in causes he barely understood. In his mind, however, it was simple. The oppressed of the world were his allies. He saw himself as their patron,
the man defying empires with faith and oil money. Meanwhile, inside Libya, his grip tightened further. He dissolved the Revolutionary Command Council, declaring that power now belonged directly to the people through basic people's congresses. Every village, school, and factory had one. But behind those grassroots committees stood the security forces, loyal only to him. He claimed the people ruled, but nothing happened without his approval. Posters of his face adorned schools, offices, and streets. State television broadcast his speeches daily. The man who had once denounced kings now ruled with more grandeur than one. He lived in heavily guarded compounds, wore flowing robes, and was surrounded by an elite unit of female bodyguards, symbols of both his eccentricity and his power. Abroad, his actions grew bolder. He sent troops into Chad in support of rebel factions. He was accused of plotting assassinations against exiled opponents in Europe. And in 1980, a series of mysterious killings of Libyan dissidents abroad made headlines. Western governments condemned him. Washington imposed sanctions. The United Nations began monitoring Libya's support for terrorist movements. But Gaddafi wore their outrage like armor. He saw every accusation as proof of his success, evidence that he had shaken the global order. In 1979, after protesters in Tripoli burned the U.S. embassy, he severed diplomatic ties entirely. Libya became, in his words, the first truly free state in the modern world. Yet behind that defiance, cracks were forming. The revolutionary committees, once tools of empowerment, turned into instruments of fear. Ordinary citizens whispered before speaking. Books were censored, journalists vanished, and even jokes about the leader could mean imprisonment. Still, Gaddafi's image, part philosopher, part warrior, part mystic, continued to captivate many across Africa and the Arab world. In a sea of compliant rulers, he remained the man who dared to defy the West, a living symbol of rebellion. But by 1981, the tide was turning. The United States had a new president, Ronald Reagan, who saw Gaddafi not as a revolutionary, but as a threat to be contained. Libya's oil wealth, military ambitions, and radical rhetoric had made it a target. The world was preparing to confront the colonel, and for the first time since his rise to power, Gaddafi would find himself facing not admiration, but isolation and the shadow of war. The revolutionary who had once outsmarted kings and oil barons was about to meet his greatest test, survival in a world that no longer believed in his dream. The Mediterranean shimmered under the burning sun, calm, deceptive, endless. But in the early 1980s, those waters became a line between defiance and destruction. Muammar Gaddafi called it the line of death, an invisible boundary across the Gulf of Sidra, stretching from Misrata to Benghazi. He warned the world, anyone who crosses this line will not return alive. To him, it wasn't just a claim of sovereignty. It was a challenge to the West, a test of whether America dared to defy him in his own sea. In August 1981, that challenge was answered. The U.S. Sixth Fleet sailed into the Gulf. 2 F-14 Tomcat jets from the USS Nimitz patrolled the skies above the blue expanse. Below them, Libyan radar locked on. Moments later, 2 Libyan Sukhoi Su-22 fighters streaked in from the coast. It was over in less than a minute. The Libyan jets fired first. A missile flared, missed, and vanished into the sea. The Americans retaliated instantly. 2 Sidewinders struck their marks. Both Libyan planes exploded in orange fireballs, crashing into the waves. Gaddafi's line of death had been crossed and broken. The world's headlines blazed. U.S. shoots down Libyan jets. Gaddafi humiliated.
But inside Tripoli, the colonel was unmoved. He appeared on television, defiant as ever. "America has declared war on the Libyan people," he said. He vowed revenge, not just on the United States, but on the empire of arrogance. What followed was a new kind of war, one fought in the shadows. Throughout the early 1980s, Libya became the nerve center of global resistance movements. Gaddafi offered money, weapons, and training to militant groups across the world: the Red Army faction in Germany, the Irish Republican Army, and Palestinian factions resisting Israel. To him, these were freedom fighters. To Washington and its allies, they were terrorists. As attacks on Western interests mounted, from Rome to Vienna, suspicion always seemed to trace back to Tripoli. American intelligence began piecing together a web of operations, allegedly funded by Libya. By 1985, the CIA labeled Gaddafi the most dangerous man in the world. But the colonel believed he was fulfilling a sacred duty. He saw himself as the spear of the oppressed, striking back at a world that had humiliated the Arabs for generations. Meanwhile, inside Libya, the revolution deepened its grip. The People's Committees ruled every neighborhood. Green flags fluttered in every town square. Children learned songs about the colonel's courage and the evils of imperialism. Public executions of traitors were broadcast live on television. The desert nation had become a fortress of ideology, but outside its borders, the walls were closing in. In 1984, British police surrounded the Libyan embassy in London after gunfire erupted from inside. A British policewoman, Yvonne Fletcher, was killed. The world watched in horror as diplomats refused to surrender. The event sent shockwaves through Europe and hardened international anger against Libya. By 1985, Ronald Reagan, the American president who had once called the Soviet Union the evil empire, found a new villain to condemn. He called Gaddafi the mad dog of the Middle East. To Gaddafi, that insult was proof of his importance. "If the devil hates you, then you are serving God," he said in a speech. But behind the bluster, fear was growing. The colonel began sleeping in tents instead of palaces, changing locations constantly to evade attacks. He trusted almost no one. Even his own guards were rotated regularly, chosen from distant tribes. The more he tried to project power, the more he isolated himself. Libya, rich in oil, was becoming politically impoverished, cut off from most of the world. Then came April 1986, the moment when words turned into fire. April 5, 1986. A crowded nightclub in West Berlin pulsed with music and lights. Young soldiers, tourists, and locals danced beneath neon signs. Then, without warning, an explosion. The Labelle discotheque was torn apart. 3 people were killed, more than 200 wounded, including dozens of American servicemen. Evidence pointed to Libyan agents. Telephone intercepts from Tripoli confirmed the connection. Washington's patience had run out. 10 days later, the night sky over the Mediterranean lit up with thunder. Operation El Dorado Canyon had begun. From British air bases, American F-111 bombers roared into the air. They flew low over Europe, avoiding radar, then crossed into Libyan airspace just before midnight. Their targets? Military bases, command centers, and most controversially, Gaddafi's own residence in Tripoli. In the quiet of the night, Libyan anti-aircraft guns blazed wildly, tracing red lines into the sky. Then came the bombs.
Explosions tore through the capital. The Baba al-Azizia compound, Gaddafi's main headquarters, was hit. Buildings collapsed. Fires raged. Gaddafi survived, reportedly pulled from the wreckage by his guards, but his young adopted daughter was killed, a tragedy he would never forgive. On state television, he appeared hours later, wrapped in his traditional robes, shouting defiantly into the camera, "We will never kneel to the American invaders." Crowds filled the streets, waving green flags and chanting his name. To many Libyans, their leader had become a living symbol of resistance, the man who survived the wrath of the world's greatest power. To Washington, the airstrikes were a message. The era of patience was over. Any state that sponsored terror would pay in blood. The bombing split global opinion. Europe trembled, the Arab world raged, and the Soviet Union condemned it as an act of imperial aggression. But inside Libya, Gaddafi's image was reborn, not as a tyrant, but as a survivor of divine destiny. Still, the damage was immense. Scores of civilians were killed, Libya's infrastructure lay in ruins, and internationally, the country became a pariah. The United Nations imposed sanctions, foreign investors fled, airlines stopped flying into Tripoli. Yet Gaddafi refused to retreat. He doubled down on his revolutionary vision. He ordered the mass distribution of his Green Book, demanded new loyalty pledges from his ministers, and told his people, "Every drop of Libyan blood spilled will water the tree of freedom." In reality, Libya's isolation deepened. Economic stagnation took hold. Intellectuals and reformers fled the country. The promise of his early revolution, equality, education, self-rule, was being buried beneath fear and propaganda. But Gaddafi didn't see decline. He saw destiny. He believed he had survived the bombs for a reason. In his mind, God had chosen him to lead not just Libya, but all of Africa into a new age of independence. He shifted his focus southward, toward the African continent. There he would find new allies, new dreams, and new battles to fight. The man the West tried to silence was not finished. He had simply changed the battlefield. And as the smoke of 1986 cleared, Gaddafi looked once more into the desert horizon and whispered, "They can destroy our cities, but not our will." The desert stretched endlessly before him, silent, golden, and cruel. It was 1987, and once again, Muammar Gaddafi had turned to the sands for answers. The confrontation with America had shaken him, but not broken him. Now he sought redemption in Africa, in a war that few understood, and even fewer cared to fight. For nearly a decade, Libya had been locked in a strange and bitter conflict with its southern neighbor, Chad, one of the poorest nations on earth. The cause seemed trivial, a strip of barren desert known as the Ayozu Strip, believed to hold uranium deposits. But to Gaddafi, it was more than land. It was pride, proof that Libya could stand tall against the world. He sent thousands of soldiers south, their trucks cutting trails across the dunes. His dream was to expand Libya's influence deep into Africa, creating a vast federation of Arab and African states, united under his leadership. In his mind, he was not a dictator. He was a visionary, a redeemer of the continent. But the desert has no loyalty, and the war in Chad would soon turn into a lesson in humility. By 1987, Libyan forces found themselves facing not just Chadian troops, but a determined coalition backed by France and the United States. Chad's fighters, mounted in pickup trucks armed with French-supplied missiles, darted across the sands like ghosts. They called it the Toyota War, and it became a nightmare for Libya. In just a few months, the Libyan army, equipped with tanks and aircraft, was routed by smaller, faster Chadian units. Entire garrisons were wiped out. Thousands of Libyan soldiers were captured.
When the last battle ended, the desert was littered with wrecked tanks and abandoned dreams. It was one of the greatest humiliations of Gaddafi's rule. He had poured millions into a war that ended with nothing gained and everything lost. When the soldiers returned home, the people were silent. They no longer cheered as loudly. Even within his government, whispers began to spread. Had the colonel lost his touch? But Gaddafi refused to admit defeat. He turned his back on the desert and looked inward and southward. He declared that the future of Libya no longer lay with the Arabs of the Middle East, but with the Africans of the continent. In a fiery speech, he told his people, "The Arabs betrayed us. Africa is our destiny." And with that, the Pan-African dream began to take shape. He poured Libya's oil wealth into Africa, funding roads, hospitals, and liberation movements. From Ghana to Mali, Niger to Zimbabwe, he offered aid and weapons, hoping to win loyalty. He styled himself as a modern pharaoh, a father figure for all Africa. But beneath the grand speeches, suspicion lingered. Was Gaddafi's generosity born of genuine brotherhood or a hunger for control? In the late 1980s, as the Cold War wound down, the world began to change. Superpowers were withdrawing from Africa. Colonial influences were fading. And into that vacuum stepped Gaddafi, wearing robes of gold and carrying the banner of unity. He invited African leaders to Tripoli, hosting lavish summits under his giant tent. He spoke not of communism or capitalism, but of the Third Universal Theory, his self-created philosophy blending socialism, Islam, and tribal democracy. He told them Africa must have one army, one currency, one government. Some listened politely, others rolled their eyes in private. But a few, the desperate, the poor, the hopeful, saw in Gaddafi's words the promise of dignity, and for a time, the idea of a United States of Africa began to shimmer like a mirage over the Sahara. Still, Libya's isolation from the wider world grew deeper. The United States and Britain maintained sanctions. Air travel was restricted. Foreign banks froze Libyan assets after the Lockerbie bombing in 1988, when a Pan Am flight exploded over Scotland, killing 270 people. Investigators traced the attack to Libyan agents. Gaddafi denied involvement, but the world had made up its mind. Once again, Libya was a pariah, and Gaddafi the eternal outsider. He retreated into symbolism. He built monuments celebrating the Jamahiriya, the people's state, and erected statues of a giant golden fist crushing an American jet. His speeches became longer, his tone more mystical. He spoke of destiny, of divine mission, of a world led by tribes instead of tyrants. To his followers, he was the voice of independence. To his critics, he was a man lost in his own myth. But through all the isolation and defiance, Gaddafi's influence in Africa continued to grow. While the West closed its doors, Africa opened its arms. The 1990s dawned with the world in transformation. The Soviet Union collapsed. The Cold War ended. And Gaddafi, once the revolutionary face of Arab socialism, reinvented himself once again. Now he called himself King of Kings. Across Africa, he funded liberation movements that had outlasted their colonial masters. In Mandela's South Africa, in the Congo, in Eritrea, Libyan money flowed like the desert wind. He supported rebels and governments alike, playing both sides when it suited him. He envisioned Africa as a single proud entity, bound by history, race, and struggle. He built mosques and schools. He sponsored scholarships for African students to study in Tripoli. He hosted vast Pan-African gatherings beneath tents adorned with gold embroidery. In one meeting, tribal chiefs from across the continent crowned him with a golden scepter, proclaiming him King of Kings of Africa. For Gaddafi, it was not arrogance, it was validation. He had dreamed of uniting a continent, and now, for a moment, it seemed real. He poured billions into the creation of the African Union, replacing the old Organization of African Unity in 2001. He envisioned a single African passport, an African currency, and an African defense force. He wanted Africa to speak with one voice, his. But even as his power expanded abroad, his grip at home was tightening too hard. Inside Libya, freedom was fading faster than ever. Critics vanished, dissidents were executed. Even mentioning political reform could land someone in prison or worse. The revolutionary committees monitored every street and school. Fear became a silent citizen. Yet to the outside world, Gaddafi's image began to soften. He funded peace efforts in Sudan, supported anti-apartheid causes, and offered mediation in African conflicts. To the global media, he transformed from the mad dog of the 1980s to a shrewd elder statesman of the 1990s. Still, beneath the robes and the rhetoric, paranoia simmered. He no longer trusted the Arab League, viewing it as a puppet of the West. He distanced himself from Middle Eastern politics, calling Arabs hopelessly divided. Africa was now his sanctuary and his stage. In 1999, after years of sanctions, Libya finally handed over 2 suspects in the Lockerbie bombing for trial. It was a calculated gesture, a signal that Gaddafi was ready to re-enter the global order. And it worked. By the turn of the millennium, Western diplomats began returning to Tripoli. Oil contracts were renegotiated. The same governments that had once bombed Libya were now shaking hands under the desert sun. To Gaddafi, it felt like vindication. He had outlasted them all, Reagan, Thatcher, even the Soviet Union itself. But history has a way of humbling even the most enduring of men. The colonel, now older and grayer, still stood beneath his tent preaching unity, justice, and revolution, unaware that his own revolution was aging too. His people still sang his songs, but their eyes told another story. The wealth of Libya, its oil, its future, remained trapped in the hands of the few. The people's state had become a personal kingdom. And while the colonel dreamed of uniting Africa, his own citizens were quietly dreaming of freedom. As the sun set over the Sahara, Gaddafi stood once more at the mouth of his tent, gazing toward the horizon. He saw in the shifting dunes the shape of his destiny, vast, eternal, and untouchable. But the wind carried whispers he could not silence. Whispers of change, whispers of the storm to come. For though he had crowned himself the King of Africa, the world would soon remind him that no throne built on fear lasts forever.
The year was 2011. Across the Arab world, a spark had caught fire. From Tunisia to Egypt, Yemen to Syria, millions took to the streets, shouting not for war, but for dignity. They called it the Arab Spring, but for those who ruled, it felt more like a storm. In Libya, Muammar Gaddafi watched from his palace in Bab al-Azizia, the same fortress that had withstood bombs and rebellions for decades. He was 68 now, older, grayer, and still clinging to power that no longer inspired fear, only fatigue. For 42 years he had ruled as the brother leader, the guide of the revolution, the king of kings. But outside his compound, a new generation had grown up, one that no longer remembered the revolution, only the silence that followed it. It began in Benghazi. Protests broke out after the arrest of a human rights lawyer.
What started as chants for reform quickly turned into cries for Gaddafi's removal. The government's response was swift and brutal. Security forces opened fire on demonstrators. Bodies fell, blood stained the streets. But instead of fear, the violence fueled rage. Tribes, soldiers, and ordinary citizens began to defect. Soon, eastern Libya had risen in open rebellion. Gaddafi appeared on state television, his face hardened, his words trembling with fury. He called the protesters rats and vowed to hunt them house by house, alley by alley. The world watched in disbelief. It was as if time had stopped and the old colonel was fighting ghosts. But this was not 1980 or 1990. The age of secrecy was gone. Videos of massacres flooded social media. Satellite images, international reporters, and the voices of Libyan exiles made sure the world could see everything. By March, the conflict had turned into a civil war. The United Nations condemned the violence, and soon after, NATO stepped in, launching airstrikes under the banner of protecting civilians. To Gaddafi, it was déjà vu, another Western conspiracy, another betrayal. He raged against America and Europe. He accused them of stealing Libya's oil and destroying African unity. And in his mind, he was right. The West had never forgiven him for defying their order. But the truth was more complex. After decades of fear, the Libyan people had simply had enough. In Tripoli, once loyal citizens whispered of change. In Misrata and Zintan, militias formed. The same green flag that had once unified the nation was now torn apart by rebellion. Even his closest allies began to vanish. Ambassadors defected, generals disappeared. His once unshakable inner circle began to crumble. Still, Gaddafi refused to flee. He could have escaped, to Algeria, to Niger, to some hidden palace in the desert. But he didn't. He said, "I was born here and I will die here." The airstrikes grew relentless. Convoys were destroyed, bases flattened, and communications cut. Each night, the sky above Tripoli glowed with fire. Inside his tent, surrounded by a shrinking circle of loyalists, Gaddafi continued to broadcast defiance. He quoted the Quran, ranted about colonialism, and swore that Libya would never kneel. But the end was already written, not in his speeches, but in the faces of the young Libyans holding phones instead of guns, shouting for freedom instead of ideology. The revolution he had once championed had finally turned against him.
By August 2011, Tripoli had fallen. Rebel forces poured into the capital, greeted by cheering crowds. Statues of Gaddafi were pulled down, his portraits burned. The compound of Bab al-Azizia, once the beating heart of his regime, was reduced to rubble. But Gaddafi was gone. No one knew where he was. For weeks, rumors swirled that he had fled to the desert, or taken refuge in the south, or crossed into Algeria. The truth was simpler. He was hiding in his hometown of Sirte, the same city where his story had begun. Sirte was his last fortress, surrounded by loyal fighters and family members. To them, he was still the leader, not a tyrant, but a father, a protector, a symbol. But NATO planes circled above, and rebel forces closed in from all sides. For 2 months, Sirte endured bombardment and siege. Buildings collapsed. Civilians fled. The Mediterranean wind carried the sound of explosions through empty streets. In his final days, Gaddafi moved from house to house, sleeping in basements and abandoned schools. He still believed that the world would turn in his favor, that Africa would rise for him, or that the tribes would rally once more. But there was no army left, only echoes. On the morning of October 20, 2011, a NATO airstrike hit a convoy trying to escape Sirte. Among the burning vehicles was a small car carrying Gaddafi and his guards. They fled on foot, crawling through culverts and rubble, chased by rebels shouting, "Allahu Akbar." Moments later, the Desert King was captured. The scene was chaotic.
furious young men, cell phones recording, gunfire echoing. The man who had ruled Libya for 42 years was dragged through the dust, bleeding, confused, still calling out, "Don't shoot, what did I do to you?" A lifetime of power ended, not in a palace, but in a drainage pipe. And then, silence. The footage of his death spread across the world in minutes. Some celebrated, others recoiled. World leaders spoke of democracy, justice, and new beginnings. But in Libya, the skies remained heavy. For though the dictator was gone, the system he had built, one of tribal division, fear, and dependence, had not vanished with him. The revolution had ended, but the struggle for Libya had only just begun. Years later, the world would still argue about him. Was Gaddafi a visionary or a villain? A reformer or a tyrant? A man who loved his people or one who ruled them too long to understand what love meant? His legacy was a paradox. He gave Libya free education, health care, and the highest living standards in Africa. He built cities where there had been sand and dreams where there had been despair. But he also built prisons, silenced voices, and crushed hope beneath the weight of his own certainty. He wanted to unite Africa, yet divided his own nation. He fought imperialism, yet became an emperor himself. He preached equality, yet ruled as one above all. History rarely offers simple answers. It remembers both the man and the myth. And so, when the desert wind sweeps across the ruins of Sirte, it carries whispers of both. Of a boy who dreamed of freeing his people, of a ruler who lost himself in his own reflection, of a king who built castles in the sand, only to be buried beneath them. In the end, Gaddafi's story is not just the story of one man. It is the story of a continent searching for identity, of a world struggling between order and freedom, and of a truth as old as time, that power, no matter how absolute, cannot outlive the will of the people. The desert keeps its secrets, but sometimes when the wind blows just right, you can still hear his voice, defiant, unbroken, and fading into history. I am not afraid to die. I am only afraid that my people will not understand me.
As the dust settles over Sirte and the echoes of revolution fade into memory, one truth remains. Power is never permanent. Empires fall, kings vanish, but the stories they leave behind, those shape generations. Muammar Gaddafi's rise and fall is not just the story of Libya. It's the story of every nation that dared to break free and every leader who believed they could outlast time itself. The world watched him challenge the West, reshape Africa, and rule with iron and vision, until history reminded him, as it reminds us all, no throne stands forever in the shifting sands. The desert remembers, the people endure. If this story moved you, don't just watch history, understand it. Subscribe now to 20th Century Transformation, where we uncover the revolutions, betrayals, and moments that changed the world forever. Hit the bell icon so you never miss the next story, because history isn't just in the past, it's still being written.